One of the crucial aspects in trying to understand why North Borneo participated in the merger to form Malaysia is to look at Singapore's involvement and Singapore's desires in the lead up to 1961. Now, there are a number of narratives that suggest that Singapore came late into the discussion with regards to the merger, the plan for merger, and that's simply not true. Historical documents tell us that the discussion and negotiations for merger had begun significantly earlier in the late 1950s. If you listen to Lee Kwan Yew's speeches and his personal recordings and writings, he's very adamant that the only way forward for Singapore is to merge with Malaya. Now, in September 1961, the Borneo territories are not part of the equation as far as a merger is concerned. Any discussion at that point in time is a merger exclusively between Malaya, or the Federation, and Singapore. Whilst we have this belief that this merger only really came about when the Borneo territories were put forward as part of a partnership to form Malaysia, that's simply not true, as we've discovered through months of research. Now, what's interesting is in part one, which I'm sharing now, and it's absolutely brilliant that we have Lee Kwan Yew actually explaining to us step by step the stages leading up to merger. This recording is from the 15th of September 1961, 2 years before Malaysia was formed. And he's explaining in his mind the reasons why he wanted an end to colonial rule and he wanted self-determination and self-rule for Singapore. These thoughts that Lee Kwan Yew shares are not very far off from how Donald Stevens sees British colonial rule. If you were to see the Australian and British governments with regards to intelligence and diplomatic papers, they write exclusively that Donald Stevens is pushing for independence and self-rule and self-determination. And his thoughts are not very far off from how Lee Kwan Yew sees the world and also how he sees colonial rule. They are parallel with each other. And so Lee Kwan Yew explains this far better than we ever can in his own words.
My colleagues and I are that generation of young men who went through the Second World War and the Japanese occupation and emerged determined that no one, neither the Japanese nor the British, had the right to push and kick us around. We were determined that we could govern ourselves and bring up our children in a country where we can be proud to be a self-respecting people. When the war came to an end in 1945, there was never a chance of the old type of British colonial system ever being recreated. The scales had fallen from our eyes, and we saw for ourselves that the local people could run the country. In fact, the local people did run the country for the Japanese military administration. The Europeans had a better life in our country, more pay, bigger houses, bigger cars, a higher standard of living. Not because they were more capable, but because power and military might was on their side. When that power went, they were stripped literally naked as prisoners of war and became very ordinary people. It was the Japanese 10-cent store man who, backed by Japanese military might, suddenly became the big boss who occupied the big house and had the better life. 3 years after the end of the Second World War, a violent revolution started in Malaya. The communists, who were almost a non-existent force in the years before the war, were allowed to arm themselves as a force just before the British surrendered. They went underground with those arms, over 3.5 years, partly with the arms they took underground, and partly with more arms parachuted in by the Allies, they built up a tough little army in the jungles. With the surrender of the Japanese, they came out into the towns. Then, for the first time, the MCP emerged as a legally recognized political force in our country. But it was not for long. In 1948, they retreated to the jungles and the armed insurrection, which was called the Emergency, started. That was a fierce and grim revolt. The angry young men from the Chinese middle schools who hated colonialism and the British joined the communists to rid the country of British imperialism. In those tough years, 1949 and 1950, we got our first taste of the practical realities of politics. We had learned the theories of socialism, communism, and capitalism in books, and read the histories of other revolutions. But we now began to understand the meaning of revolution in terms of life and blood, liberty and incarceration, hate and fear, love and comradeship. We have learned one important thing during the last decade, that only those count and matter who have the strength and courage of their convictions to stick up and stand up for what they believe in, for their people, for their country, regardless of what happens to themselves.